I've decided for the cap of our flower, I'm going to do a padded satin stitch over here. I'm going to do two types of padding. I'm going to do a thread padding in the center of our shape that's going to create a really nice 3D shape. And around the outline of it, I'm going to do some string padding. So to do your string padding, I've actually taken two pieces of floss, so there's 12 strands here total, and twisted it together and steamed it in place so it's going to hold its shape as a nice little string so that it's going to be the same color as the rest of my work. And I'll just start on, I'll start on the edge here because I think that's a good place to plunge my ends when I'm finished. So all you want to do is find a place to start on your design, and you're going to sew over your string. It's super low tech. The technique is called couching, technically, because we are sewing a thread or a lump of threads together using another thread. So the 2-ply that I'm using to sew this down is going to just make this go nice and quick, and it's all one color, and it's the color that I'm going to fill the whole cap with here in a little bit. So this is just going to get us started, but it's going to help us get a really, really nice edge on our shape as we do our padded satin stitch. This is going to give us something really nice and heavy to sew against that'll help lift up our stitches and make them really, really delightful and three-dimensional. You can go heavier than this. If you want it to really stand out up off the shape, you could use 4 times the amount of string that I'm using, or you can get a hard string. You certainly don't have to use floss for this. And in fact, the technique is really intended for either soft or hard string, not necessarily for floss. But I find that if I use floss and I keep it nice and twisted as I'm stitching it down, it does a pretty good job of adding the dimension that I want. All right, now that I've couched all the way around, I need to plunge my ends. Plunging your ends is really, really quite simple. It basically just means you're going to make a big ol' hole with a big thick needle or a stiletto in your fabric, and then thread up another needle in a nice thin thread. Pop your needle straight through so that you've got a little loop here that you will use to catch the ends of your padding, and you'll pull it straight through the fabric. So I'm going to draw a little shape of my padding here for my initial round, and we really are just going to stitch a traditional satin stitch here, or you can use a laid stitch if you prefer. It doesn't really matter. I think I'll use a laid stitch because it's going to be a little bit more economic. I hate using a traditional satin stitch unless my work is going to be visible on both sides because it just wastes thread. And I'm using a real nice big chunky needle here, so it's going to be making some loud pop noises because I'm working with an awful lot of floss. And on this first one, honestly, I'm never too precious about it because it's just about getting a little bit of initial volume here to start filling out the shape. And we're going to go over this multiple times. The more layers of thread you use, the more layers of stitching you do, the more volume you're going to get on your padded shape, and the more dramatic that stitching is going to be. So it really is up to you in terms of design and aesthetic, how many layers of padding you want to go. But on this one, I'm thinking we're probably going to do 4 or 5 so that we can get a nice, big, dramatic shape, especially in the center here where there's a lot of real estate. The more layers I do, the more delicate I'll start getting with my padding. But on this first layer, I just like to chunk it in. Just get it going. Make an impact. All right, now that I've done my first little layer here, I'm going to go around and do the same thing and just expand on it. I'm going to really be focusing on stitching in this area building up this crown here. And then we'll probably do a little bit of laying some stitches down through here to fill in the space. But we're not going to focus on that too much right now. And you'll notice on most things like this, I like to start in the middle. I really find that if you sew from the center of your shape out and then do the other side, you just get the best tension. You get the best work overall. It's the best bang for your buck, and it's consistent. And you don't have to worry as much about warping your fabric or making it irritated. So I do a lot of stitching from the widest point, which is usually somewhere in the middle, out. And it's just a good way to get set up. And you'll notice that as I get to the top and bottom here, I'm going to be stitching a little bit beyond my shape so that I'm going to start making that kind of gradual layers building up. So now that I've done that, I will go again on the other direction. All right, and with that, we have our padding accomplished. So what we're really doing here is raising up our final stitch that we're about to do, half a millimeter or so off the fabric, and then filling in all of the space with a bit of thread to lift the fibers that span the shape up so nothing sinks in or divots or gets sad. So now we are on to our actual satin stitch. Finally, the real thing that we came here to do. So I'm going to work it in 2-ply, which is the most thread I like to work a satin stitch in. And I'm actually going to continue to do more of a laid stitch than a satin stitch in most places because I prefer it, but it's accomplishing the same thing. The thing that's really important when we're working our pretty stitch over this is to make sure that we are keeping our stitches perfectly parallel and really stacked up right next to each other. And the angle that we're going in the fabric is really important. Every stitch I take, I'm sewing my needle diagonally underneath the shape or diagonally from underneath the shape. So when I'm coming back up right now, when I sew up in the fabric, my needle's at an angle going that way, going toward my right, at an angle, coming up from underneath the fabric. And when I sew it into the shape, I'm really sewing it underneath my padding. And that's really going to wrap that string pad that we've done so that we get a really clean, finished, pretty edge. And it should be very glossy and satiny at the end when we're finished. And that is our padded satin stitch. It's nice and raised off of the edge of our fabric, about a 0.5 millimeter. It is fully covered and quite lovely and satiny and shiny in contrast to our highly textured flower. I'm going to take a few extra stitches, adding some definition to the shape in my piece just to break up some of these very long traveling stitches. And I think I'll just do a few little chain stitches, just kind of working its way into the pattern and floating on top of all of my padded satin stitch. So I'm going to be quite delicate as I do this because I don't want to crush anything or interfere with my lovely little satin stitch. But I do think it would be nice to see a bit of definition in the shape. And I think a chain stitch is quite lovely for this. You could use a back stitch or a split stitch or something a little less wide and low profile if you wanted some really nice fine lines. But I think something with a bit of interest is lovely. So that's what I'm going to do. And that is our flower cap. In the next video, we'll look at how to do these little loopy bits coming off the back of the flower cap and follow the stem down to the bottom.